The fire had already reached the second row of wooden benches when Elena Voss realized no one was going to stop it. She stood at the center of the ceremony hall, her white bonding dress catching the orange light, and she watched Damien's face change from something cold to something colder. The whole pack was watching. Hundreds of eyes, all fixed on her, waiting for the words that would decide the rest of her life. "I reject you," Damien said. The words landed harder than any blow could have. Elena felt her knees weaken, but she forced herself to stay standing. A murmur rolled through the crowd, like wind through dry grass. Somewhere near the back, someone gasped. Somewhere else, someone laughed, quiet and cruel. Elena had spent 19 years preparing for this night. She had trained with the healers, studied pack law with the elders, learned to carry herself the way a Luna should. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that loyalty and effort were enough to earn love. She had believed that the bond between her and Damien, the invisible thread that had tied their fates together since birth, meant something. It meant nothing to him. "You cannot do this," said Elena's mother, stepping forward from the crowd, her voice shaking. "The bond is sacred. You cannot simply throw it away." "I can," Damien said, "and I have." He did not even look at Elena's mother when he spoke. His eyes were fixed on Elena, and there was no apology in them, only impatience, as if she were a task he was relieved to finish. Elena felt something cold settle in her chest, right where the bond used to hum quietly beneath her skin. For as long as she could remember, that hum had been there, a soft reminder that she belonged to someone, that she mattered to someone. Now it was gone. In its place was silence, a silence so complete it frightened her more than the humiliation did. She looked around the hall. Faces she had known her whole life stared back at her, some with pity, most with the particular hunger people have when they watch someone else fall. The Blackthorn pack had never fully accepted her, not really. Her mother had married into the pack from outside, and Elena had always been seen as slightly foreign, slightly less than the daughters of pure Blackthorn blood. Tonight, that difference had become the perfect excuse. "She was never right for the pack," she heard someone whisper. "Poor girl. Imagine being rejected in front of everyone. I always thought there was something strange about her anyway." Elena straightened her spine. She would not cry, not here, not in front of people who would use her tears as proof that she had always been weak. She turned to Damien one last time. "Why?" she asked. Her voice did not shake, though everything inside her did. Damien's jaw tightened. For one brief second, something flickered behind his eyes, something that might have been guilt, or might have been fear. Then it was gone, replaced by the same hard mask he had worn since the ceremony began. "The elders have decided," he said. "There are matters beyond you and me. The pack owes a debt, and you are how we pay it." Elena did not understand what he meant, not fully, not yet, but she would understand soon enough. The elders explained it to her afterward, in a small stone room that smelled of old parchment and older secrets. She sat across from three men whose names she had known her whole life, but whose true nature she was only now beginning to see. They spoke of alliances, of debts owed to a kingdom far to the north, of a king who had once saved the Blackthorn pack from destruction and now wanted something in return. "You will go to King Roderick Ashgrave," the eldest of them said, a man named Edwin with a beard the color of ash. "It has been arranged. You will live at his court, under his protection, and in exchange, the debt our pack owes him will be considered paid." "You are giving me away," Elena said flatly, "like property." "We are giving you a chance," Edwin said, though he did not meet her eyes when he said it. "The rejection freed you from any claim this pack has on you. You are no longer bound here. What happens to you now is your own path." Elena wanted to scream that this was not freedom, that being handed from one man's rejection to another man's court was not a path she had chosen, but she knew arguing would change nothing. The decision had already been made long before she stepped into the ceremony hall that night. Perhaps it had been made months ago, perhaps years. She had simply been the last to know. She was given one day to prepare, one day to pack the small collection of belongings she was permitted to bring, one day to say goodbye to the handful of people in the pack who had ever shown her real kindness. Her mother wept quietly in the corner of their small home, apologizing over and over for a decision that was never hers to make. "I should have taken you away from here years ago," her mother said, gripping Elena's hands so tightly it almost hurt. "I should have seen this coming." "You couldn't have known," Elena said, though privately she wondered if that was entirely true. There had always been a distance in Damien's eyes when he looked at her, a distance she had chosen not to see, because seeing it would have meant admitting the life she had been promised was never real. That night, unable to sleep, Elena walked to the edge of the pack's territory, to the tall pine trees that marked the border between Blackthorn land and the wilderness beyond. The air was cold and sharp, and the stars above her burned with a clarity that felt almost mocking, as if the universe wanted her to see clearly just how alone she truly was. She pressed a hand to her chest, to the place where the bond had lived. It was still silent, still empty, but as she stood there in the darkness, she noticed something strange, a faint warmth, deep beneath the emptiness, like an ember buried under ash. It was not the bond, it was something else entirely, something she had never felt before, something that seemed to stir the moment she stopped waiting for Damien's love and started, for the first time in her life, listening to herself. She did not know what it was. She only knew that it frightened her a little, and that some small, stubborn part of her was curious rather than afraid. The carriage arrived at dawn. It was a plain, sturdy thing, pulled by 2 dark horses, with a single guard sent from King Roderick's court to escort her north. His name was Nathaniel, a quiet man with kind eyes and a scar along his jaw, who spoke little, but treated Elena with more respect in the first hour of their journey than most of the pack had shown her in years. "The journey is long," he told her as they left the Blackthorn territory behind. 3 days, maybe 4 if the weather turns. "You should rest while you can." Elena did not rest. She watched the trees blur past the carriage window, watched the familiar hills of her childhood shrink into the distance, and felt the strange combination of grief and relief that comes with leaving behind a life that was never truly yours to begin with. "What is he like?" she finally asked, on the second day of their journey. "The king." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment before answering. "He was not always as he is now," he said carefully. "There was a war, years ago. He lost people he loved. Since then, he has become difficult to know. Some say he feels nothing at all anymore. Others say he feels too much, and it is easier for everyone if they believe the first story." "And which do you believe?" Nathaniel glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "I believe a man does not build walls that high unless there is something behind them worth protecting." Elena turned that thought over in her mind for the rest of the journey. She had expected a monster, a warlord, as cruel and unfeeling as the stories claimed. She had prepared herself for cruelty, had steeled her heart against it the way she had once steeled it against Damien's indifference. But Nathaniel's words planted a small, unwelcome seed of curiosity, and try as she might, she could not entirely dig it out. On the 4th day, the towers of Ashgrave Castle appeared on the horizon, dark and imposing against a gray sky. The closer they came, the more Elena noticed the state of the kingdom around it. Fields that should have been full with the season's harvest stood half-tended. Villages they passed through were quiet, watchful, the people inside them thin and tired in a way that spoke of years of hardship rather than a single bad season. "The war took much from this land," Nathaniel said, noticing her expression. "The king has spent years trying to rebuild what was lost. It has not been easy." The carriage passed through the castle gates just as the sun began to set, painting the stone walls in shades of deep red and gold. Elena stepped down from the carriage, her legs stiff from days of travel, and looked up at the castle looming above her. It was beautiful in a broken sort of way, grand architecture scarred by old battle damage that had never been fully repaired, as if the castle itself carried the weight of everything the kingdom had endured. A steward met her at the entrance, a stern woman named Margaret, who looked her up and down with an expression Elena could not quite read. "You are the one from the Blackthorn pack," Margaret said. It was not a question. "I am Elena," she said, refusing to let herself be reduced to a debt paid, a transaction completed. Margaret's expression softened, just slightly. "Come, the king will see you before supper. He does not like to be kept waiting, and he likes surprises even less." Elena followed her through corridors lined with tapestries faded by time, past guards who watched her with quiet curiosity, until they reached a set of heavy wooden doors at the end of a long hallway. Margaret knocked once, then pushed the doors open without waiting for a response. The room beyond was dim, lit only by a low fire in a large stone hearth. A man sat near the flames, his back mostly turned to the door, and for a moment, Elena thought he had not noticed their arrival at all. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough, like something that had not been used gently in a very long time. "So," he said, still facing the fire, "you are the payment." Elena felt anger flare in her chest, sharp and sudden, cutting through the exhaustion of the journey. "I have a name," she said. Slowly the man turned. Firelight caught the sharp lines of his face, the shadows beneath his eyes, the particular stillness of someone who had trained himself not to react to anything at all. King Roderick Ashgrave studied her for a long moment, and Elena forced herself not to look away, even as something in his gaze made her feel as though he could see straight through every wall she had built around herself in the last 4 days. "Elena," he said finally, testing the name as though it were unfamiliar territory. "Voss. Yes. They tell me your alpha rejected you in front of your entire pack," he said, his tone flat, almost clinical. "And now you are here, in my court, because your pack believes handing you to me settles an old debt." Elena's jaw tightened. "That is the arrangement, yes." "Do you understand what it means to live here?" Roderick asked. "This is not a place of comfort. I have little patience for softness, and less for pity. You will not find kindness in these walls, only survival." Elena lifted her chin, refusing to let his words shrink her further than she already had been. "I did not come here looking for kindness," she said. "I came here because I had no other choice. But do not mistake my circumstances for weakness, Your Majesty. I have already survived one man's rejection. I imagine I can survive whatever this court has to offer as well." For the first time since she had entered the room, something shifted in Roderick's expression, a flicker of surprise quickly hidden behind his usual stillness. He studied her for a long moment, as if reconsidering something he had already decided about her, before she had even arrived. "We will see," he said quietly, turning back to the fire. "Margaret will show you to your chambers. Supper will be brought to you there tonight. Tomorrow, you will meet the rest of the court, and they will decide for themselves what to make of you." As Margaret led her away, Elena glanced back once at the king seated by the fire, his shoulders carrying an invisible weight she could not yet understand. She did not know what waited for her in this cold, broken kingdom. She did not know that the emptiness in her chest, the silence where the bond used to be, was not truly empty at all, but simply waiting, deep and patient, for the right moment to wake. That night, alone in an unfamiliar room, in an unfamiliar castle, Elena Voss pressed her hand once more to her chest, and felt, again, that faint and stubborn warmth stirring beneath the surface. Whatever it was growing. And for the first time since the ceremony hall, since Damien's cold rejection in front of everyone she had ever known, Elena did not feel only broken. She felt, quietly and impossibly, like the beginning of something no one in this castle, not even its broken king, was prepared for. Morning at Ashgrave Castle arrived gray and quiet, without the birdsong Elena had always known in the Blackthorn territory. She woke early, unused to the unfamiliar bed, and lay still for a moment listening to the castle breathe around her, footsteps in distant corridors, the clatter of pots somewhere far below, the low murmur of voices she could not quite make out. Margaret arrived shortly after sunrise, with a simple gray dress draped over her arm, and an expression that suggested she had already decided how the day would go. "The king wishes you to join him in the great hall for the morning court," Margaret said, setting the dress on the edge of the bed. "It is where he hears petitions, settles disputes, and where his advisors like to remind everyone how important they are." There was a dry note in her voice that told Elena this steward held little patience for the court's usual games. "Why does he want me there?" Elena asked, pulling the dress over her head. "He did not say," Margaret admitted, "but I suspect he wants the court to see you before the rumors grow too wild on their own. Better they hear the truth from his mouth than invent their own version." Elena thought of the whispers that had followed her out of the Blackthorn ceremony hall, and felt a familiar tightness in her stomach. She had hoped, foolishly, that leaving her old pack would mean leaving behind the judgment of strangers as well. It seemed she had only traded one set of watching eyes for another. The great hall was larger than anything Elena had seen in the Blackthorn territory, its high ceilings supported by stone pillars carved with old battle scenes, its long windows letting in pale morning light that did little to warm the space. Advisors and nobles clustered near the front, murmuring among themselves, and Elena felt their eyes shift toward her the moment she entered. Roderick sat upon a plain, unadorned throne, wearing none of the ceremonial finery Elena might have expected from a king. His crown, when she finally noticed it, was simple, more a mark of duty than an object of pride. He did not smile when he saw her enter, but he did incline his head slightly, a small gesture that felt strangely significant, given how still and unreadable he had been the night before. "Court," Roderick said, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "This is Elena Voss, formerly of the Blackthorn Pack. She will be residing here under my protection, as agreed in the settlement between our territories. I expect her to be treated with the same respect afforded to any guest of this court." A tall man near the front of the gathering stepped forward, his robes marking him as one of the king's senior advisors. He had sharp features and sharper eyes, and something about the way he studied Elena made her skin prickle with unease. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," the man said, his tone smooth as polished stone. "But is it wise to bring a woman rejected by her own alpha into such close proximity to the throne? Rejection is no small matter among the packs. There is often a reason behind it, even when that reason is not spoken aloud." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, humiliation and anger tangled together. Before she could find the words to defend herself, Roderick spoke first, his voice cool and final. "Careful, Simon," he said. "I did not ask for your opinion on the matter, only your presence at this court. There is a difference, and I suggest you remember it." Simon inclined his head, though the sharpness in his eyes did not fade. "Of course, Your Majesty, I only wish to protect the interests of this kingdom." "As do I," Roderick said. "Which is precisely why she is here." The exchange left Elena unsettled, though she was grateful, however reluctantly, for the king's quick defense. She had not expected it, not from a man who had greeted her the night before with such cold detachment. She wondered, briefly, if there was more beneath his stillness than the court believed, before pushing the thought away. She could not afford to let herself wonder about the broken king. She had learned enough about hoping for warmth from cold men. The morning court continued for hours, petition after petition, dispute after dispute, and Elena watched, fascinated despite herself, as Roderick handled each one with a careful, measured patience that seemed at odds with everything she had heard about him before arriving. Farmers came forward, asking for aid after a difficult harvest, and Roderick granted it without hesitation. A dispute between two merchants over stolen goods was settled fairly, with neither side left entirely satisfied, but both treated with equal consideration. He was not warm, not gentle, in the way Elena might have expected from a beloved ruler, but he was fair, methodical, and clearly exhausted by the weight of holding his kingdom together. By the time the court ended, Elena understood, at least partly, what Nathaniel had meant during their journey north. This was not a cruel man ruling through fear. This was a man who had built walls so high and so thick that almost no one could see what lay behind them, not because there was nothing there, but because whatever remained was fragile enough that exposure might shatter it completely. That evening, Elena found herself wandering the castle gardens, drawn outside by the need for fresh air after a day spent surrounded by unfamiliar faces and unfamiliar rules. The gardens were overgrown in places, clearly neglected in favor of more pressing concerns, but there was a quiet beauty to the wildness of it, vines climbing untended walls, flowers pushing up through cracks in old stone pathways. She was not entirely surprised to find Roderick there as well, standing near a small fountain that had long since stopped flowing, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on something Elena could not see. "You wander far from your chambers," he said without turning, apparently having sensed her presence before she spoke. "I could not sleep," Elena admitted, "and I did not think anyone would mind if I explored a little. Most would ask permission first." "I am not most people," Elena said, and immediately wondered if she had spoken too boldly for a woman, only one day into her stay at his court. But Roderick did not seem angered by her response. If anything, something in his shoulders loosened, just slightly. "No," he said, finally turning to look at her. "I do not suppose you are." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint rustle of wind through the overgrown vines. Elena studied him in the fading light, noticing details she had missed the night before in the dim firelight of his chambers. There were scars along his hands, small and numerous, the kind that came not from a single battle, but from years of hard, relentless survival. His eyes, when they finally met hers, held none of the coldness his voice usually carried. Instead, there was something tired there, something old and heavy, carried for far too long by a man who had likely never been given the chance to set it down. "Why did you defend me today?" Elena asked. "In the court, with Simon. You did not have to." Roderick was quiet for a long moment, as though considering how much of an answer she truly deserved. "Simon speaks before he thinks," he finally said. "He assumes rejection always means fault. I have learned, through experience, that assumption is often wrong." "You sound as though you speak from personal knowledge." Something flickered across his face, gone before Elena could fully read it. "Everyone in this castle carries scars they do not discuss at court," he said, his tone closing the subject as firmly as a door. "Yours are simply more recent than most." Elena wanted to press further, wanted to ask what scars a king carried that made him understand rejection so intimately, but something in his expression told her the conversation had reached its limit for the night. Instead, she let the silence settle between them, oddly comfortable despite everything neither of them said. "The gardens were beautiful once," Roderick said after a while, surprising her with the sudden shift in subject. "My mother tended them herself, before the war. I have not had the heart to restore them since she passed." "They are still beautiful," Elena said honestly. "Wildness has its own kind of beauty, I think. Perhaps more honest than anything carefully controlled." Roderick looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way that made Elena feel oddly exposed, as though he were seeing not just the woman standing before him, but something deeper, something she had not yet fully understood about herself. "Perhaps," he said quietly. They did not speak much more that night, but something had shifted between them, subtle and fragile, like the first crack of light through a long closed door. Elena returned to her chambers unsettled, in a way that had nothing to do with grief over Damien's rejection, and everything to do with the strange, unwanted curiosity growing in her chest whenever she thought about the broken king and the walls he kept so carefully maintained. As she lay in bed that night, staring up at the unfamiliar ceiling, Elena pressed her hand once more to her chest, searching for that faint warmth she had felt in the blackthorn forest days before. It was still there, quieter now, but unmistakable. A low and steady pulse beneath her ribs that seemed to grow warmer whenever her thoughts drifted toward the fire in Roderick's dim chambers, toward the tired honesty in his eyes when he spoke of his mother's gardens. She did not know what the feeling meant. She only knew that for the first time since the ceremony hall, since Damien's cold and public rejection, she was no longer thinking of herself as something broken, discarded, or unwanted. She was beginning, slowly and carefully, to wonder if she might be something else entirely, something neither the Blackthorn Pack nor this broken kingdom had yet begun to understand. Outside her window, the moon rose high over Ashgrave Castle, casting pale light over the overgrown gardens below, over the sleeping kingdom beyond the castle walls, and over a warmth growing quietly in Elena's chest that would soon prove far too powerful to remain hidden much longer. Days passed at Ashgrave Castle, and Elena began to settle into a routine, though nothing about her new life felt entirely settled at all. She woke early each morning, ate a quiet breakfast in her chambers, and spent her days learning the rhythms of a court that seemed to run on a fragile balance of loyalty, fear, and old grief. Margaret became something close to a friend, sharp-tongued but honest, always willing to explain the tangled politics of the castle whenever Elena grew confused. The king was not always so quiet, Margaret told her one afternoon, as they walked together through the castle's long stone corridors. Before the war, before he lost his brother and his mother in the same terrible season, he used to laugh. I remember it clearly, though it feels like a lifetime ago now. What happened to his brother? Elena asked carefully. Margaret's expression darkened. That is not my story to tell, she said. If he wishes you to know, he will tell you himself. But I will say this. The man you see now is only half of who he once was. The war took the rest, and he has spent every day since trying to hold together what remains, for the sake of a kingdom that does not always deserve his sacrifice. Elena thought of that conversation often in the days that followed, watching Roderick more closely during the morning courts, noticing the small signs of exhaustion he tried so carefully to hide, the way his hands sometimes drifted to his chest when he thought no one was watching, as though pressing down on something that ached beneath the surface. Their paths crossed more frequently as the days went on, not by any grand design, but through small, quiet moments that seemed to happen almost naturally. She would find him in the garden some evenings, standing near the broken fountain, and he would nod for her to join him, rather than sending her away. She began to understand his silences, learned that they were not always coldness, but sometimes simply the absence of anything he felt safe enough to say aloud. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into her stay, Elena found Roderick in the castle library, a place she had not yet explored, tucked away in a quiet corner of the eastern wing. He sat at a large wooden table, surrounded by old maps and worn ledgers, his expression tight with the particular frustration of a man trying to solve a problem with too few resources and too little time. "You look troubled," Elena said, stepping inside despite the small voice in her head, warning her that perhaps she was intruding. Roderick glanced up, and for a moment, something like relief crossed his features before his usual composure returned. "The northern villages need grain before winter," he said. "The harvest was poor again this year, and our reserves are already stretched thin protecting the border." "Protecting it from what?" Elena asked, moving closer to glance at the map spread across the table. "Raiders mostly. Small bands, opportunists who prey on weakened territories. We have had more trouble since the war ended than I would like to admit." He rubbed a hand over his tired eyes. "The court would prefer I spend our resources on maintaining appearances, grand feasts, elaborate ceremonies, anything to convince our neighbors we are stronger than we are. I would rather my people not starve while we play at strength we do not have." Elena studied the map for a long moment, an idea forming slowly in her mind, one shaped by lessons she had learned growing up in the Blackthorn territory, where resources had never been abundant, and creative solutions had always been necessary for survival. "My pack faced similar troubles most winters," she said. "We could not always rely on trade with wealthier packs, so we learned to preserve what we had more carefully, and to share resources between villages rather than hoarding them individually. If the northern villages pooled their remaining grain with the villages closer to the castle, distributing based on need rather than location, it might stretch further than you think." Roderick looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something like genuine surprise, tinged with curiosity. "You have experience with this kind of planning?" "I spent years helping the pack elders manage our stores," Elena admitted. "It was not glamorous work, but it kept people fed through hard winters more than once." For the first time since her arrival, Roderick's mouth curved into something that was almost, though not quite, a smile. "Perhaps," he said, "your presence here will prove more useful than simply settling an old debt." Something warm bloomed in Elena's chest at his words, a feeling she quickly tried to suppress, uncertain what to make of it. She reminded herself, firmly, that she had not come to this castle to seek approval from another man who held power over her fate. She had learned that lesson already, painfully, in the Blackthorn ceremony hall. And yet, as the days continued to pass, she found herself drawn more and more into the quiet, complicated rhythm of Roderick's world, offering suggestions during the morning courts, helping Margaret organize supply records, spending evenings in the library poring over maps and ledgers, alongside a king who seemed, slowly, to be remembering what it felt like to have someone at his side, rather than simply beneath his rule. Not everyone in the castle welcomed the change. Simon, the sharp-eyed advisor who had questioned her presence during her first morning at court, grew increasingly hostile as the weeks passed, his suspicion of Elena deepening with every small success she achieved. "She manipulates you," Elena overheard him say to Roderick one evening. their voices carrying faintly from behind a partially closed door. First, she wins the favor of the servants, then the trust of the court, and now, it seems, your own attention as well. Have you considered, Your Majesty, that this may be exactly what the Blackthorn pack intended all along? A clever way to gain influence over your throne, without the burden of an official alliance. Elena froze in the hallway, her chest tightening at Simon's accusation. She waited, breath held, for Roderick's response. Elena did not choose to come here, Roderick said, his voice low but firm. She was cast aside by the very pack you accuse of scheming through her. If anything, her rejection makes her the least likely spy among us, given how thoroughly her own people discarded her. Rejection can be staged, Simon pressed, especially when the reward is influence over a kingdom as valuable as ours. Enough, Roderick said, his tone sharp enough that Elena heard Simon fall silent immediately. I trust my own judgment in this matter, Simon. I would advise you to trust it as well, unless you wish to test exactly how much patience I have left for doubting my decisions. Elena stepped quietly away from the door before either man could discover she had been listening, her heart pounding with a strange mixture of gratitude and unease. Roderick's defense warmed something inside her, but Simon's accusations lingered uncomfortably in her mind. She had not asked to be sent here, had not schemed for any of this, but she understood, with growing clarity, that not everyone in this castle would ever believe that. That night, unable to settle her thoughts enough for sleep, Elena returned to the gardens, seeking the quiet comfort of the overgrown paths and broken fountain that had become unexpectedly familiar to her in recent weeks. She was not surprised, this time, to find Roderick already there, though his posture seemed heavier than usual, weighed down by more than the kingdom's usual burdens. You heard Simon, he said, without turning, before she had spoken a single word. I did not mean to eavesdrop, Elena admitted. It does not matter. He will not be the last to voice such suspicions, I imagine. Roderick finally turned to face her, his expression unusually open in the moonlight. For what it is worth, I do not share his doubts. Why not? Elena asked. You barely know me. I could be exactly what he fears. Roderick studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his tired eyes. Because I have spent years learning to recognize deception in the people around me, he said quietly. It is a skill born from necessity, not choice. And whatever you are, Elena Voss, you are not deceiving me. The certainty in his voice settled something unsteady inside her, though it also frightened her a little. The way trust so easily given could just as easily be shattered later, the way hope had shattered so completely on the night of her rejection. Thank you, she said softly, for believing me, even when it would be easier not to. Roderick's expression softened, just slightly, the walls around him lowering by the smallest possible degree. Easier does not always mean right, he said. I learned that lesson a long time ago, at great cost. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the moonlight casting long shadows across the overgrown garden paths, and Elena found herself, for the first time since arriving at Ashgrave Castle, feeling something that almost resembled belonging. She did not yet know how deeply that fragile trust would soon be tested, nor how the warmth still growing quietly in her chest was preparing itself for a moment neither she nor Roderick could possibly anticipate, a moment that would change everything both of them believed about who Elena truly was. Autumn deepened over Ashgrave Castle, painting the overgrown gardens in shades of amber and rust, and with the changing season came a shift Elena could not quite name but felt clearly nonetheless. The distance between herself and Roderick, once carefully maintained by both of them, had grown thinner with each passing week, replaced by something neither of them dared to speak aloud. It began with small things. He started seeking her opinion during the morning courts, not only on matters of supply and trade, where her practical knowledge had already proven valuable, but on questions of judgment as well, weighing her sense of fairness against his own. Servants who once regarded her with cautious suspicion now greeted her warmly in the corridors, having watched her treat them with a respect many nobles never bothered to offer. Even Margaret, sharp-tongued and slow to trust, had begun speaking of Elena with something close to affection. You have done more for this castle in a month than most manage in years, Margaret told her one afternoon, as they organized the autumn stores together in the castle's lower cellars. The king seems lighter these days. I had almost forgotten what that looked like. Elena felt her cheeks warm at the observation, though she tried to brush it aside. I have simply tried to be useful, she said. It is the least I can do, given everything this court has offered me. Margaret gave her a knowing look but said nothing further, and Elena was grateful for the woman's restraint, uncertain how she might have responded if pressed further on feelings she barely understood herself. The truth, quiet and undeniable, was that Elena had begun to care for Roderick in a way she had never expected, a way entirely different from anything she had felt for Damien. Where her feelings for her former alpha had been built on duty and expectation, something owed rather than chosen, her growing feelings for Roderick had emerged slowly, through shared silences in the garden, through late nights spent solving problems together in the library, through small moments of unguarded honesty neither of them offered easily to anyone else. She told herself, repeatedly, that nothing could come of it. He was a king, burdened by a kingdom's worth of responsibility, and she was little more than a debt paid, a guest tolerated at his court by circumstance rather than choice. And yet, despite every warning she gave herself, the warmth in her chest continued to grow, no longer confined to quiet moments of solitude, but flickering to life whenever Roderick's gaze lingered on her a moment longer than necessary, whenever his rare, tired smile appeared in response to something she said. One crisp evening, as the last light of sunset faded over the castle walls, Elena found herself walking alone through the gardens, lost in thought, when she noticed Roderick seated on a low stone bench near the broken fountain, his expression heavier than she had seen it in weeks. "Is something wrong?" she asked, approaching carefully. Roderick looked up, and for a moment, Elena saw something raw and unguarded in his expression, before he composed himself once more. "Today marks the anniversary of my brother's death," he said quietly. "I do not usually speak of it, but it seems this year, the weight of it is harder to carry alone." Elena sat beside him without hesitation, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "You do not have to be alone with it tonight," she said softly. "If you wish to speak of him, I am willing to listen. And if you do not, I am content simply to sit here with you." Roderick was quiet for a long moment, staring at the still, dry fountain before them. "His name was Edric," he finally said. "He was younger than me by 3 years, kinder than me in every way that mattered. He should have been the one to inherit this throne, not me. He had a gift for making people feel valued, for finding solutions where I only ever saw obstacles. What happened to him?" "The war," Roderick said simply, though the single word carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken details. "He died protecting our mother during an attack on the castle's outer walls. I was meant to be there as well, but I had been delayed elsewhere, dealing with a matter that, in hindsight, mattered far less than anything I convinced myself of at the time. By the time I returned, both of them were gone." Elena felt her chest tighten at the pain evident in his voice, carefully controlled but unmistakable nonetheless. "That was not your fault," she said gently. "I have told myself that many times," Roderick admitted. "It has never once made the guilt lessen." He turned to look at her then, something vulnerable and searching in his tired eyes. "You are the first person I have spoken to about this in years. I do not entirely understand why. Perhaps," Elena said carefully, "because for the first time in a long while, you have someone willing to simply listen, without expecting anything from you in return." Roderick studied her for a long moment, the space between them feeling suddenly, impossibly small. "You have given me more than you realize, Elena," he said quietly. "More than I ever expected from an arrangement I once resented deeply." "You resented my presence here?" Elena asked, though there was no sting in the question, only genuine curiosity. "I resented the circumstances," Roderick clarified, "the idea of a person being handed over like payment for an old debt, regardless of their own wishes in the matter. It felt, and still feels, deeply unjust. I did not resent you, not truly, not once I understood who you actually were." The honesty in his words settled something unsteady in Elena's chest, and before she fully understood her own intentions, she reached out and gently placed her hand over his, offering silent comfort in place of words she did not yet trust herself to speak aloud. Roderick did not pull away. Instead, He turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers interlocking naturally, as though some part of both of them had been waiting for this exact moment for far longer than either would admit. They sat together in comfortable silence as darkness fully settled over the gardens, the weight of grief and unspoken feeling mingling into something that felt, for the first time in either of their lives, less like a burden and more like the quiet beginning of healing. It was in this stillness, this fragile and unguarded moment, that Elena felt it again, the warmth in her chest, stronger now than she had ever felt it before, pulsing gently in rhythm with something she could not quite name. She did not understand what it meant, only that it seemed to respond, somehow, to the closeness between herself and Roderick, growing brighter whenever the walls between them lowered even slightly. Neither of them spoke of what the moment meant, as they eventually returned to their separate chambers that night, the unspoken understanding between them, too fragile, too new, to survive being named aloud just yet. But something had shifted irreversibly in the quiet garden beneath the stars, a bond forming not through obligation or old debts, but through shared vulnerability freely given and gently received. Elena lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling of her chambers, her hand pressed against her chest, where the warmth continued to pulse steadily beneath her ribs. She thought of Damien's cold rejection, of the emptiness that had followed it, and realized, with quiet astonishment, that she no longer felt haunted by that loss the way she once had. In its place was something new, something uncertain but undeniably alive, growing steadily stronger with every passing day she spent within the walls of a broken kingdom, and beside its equally broken king. She did not yet know that the warmth she felt was not simply the beginning of unexpected affection, but the earliest stirrings of something far older and far more powerful, something that would soon demand to be seen by the entire kingdom, whether Elena was ready for it or not. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the northern mountains with a bitter cold that settled over Ashgrave Castle like an unwelcome guest. Despite the harsh weather, life within the castle walls had taken on a warmth Elena could not have imagined when she first arrived, months earlier, carrying nothing but grief and uncertainty. She and Roderick had grown close in ways neither of them spoke of openly, though everyone in the castle seemed to notice regardless. Margaret had taken to smiling knowingly whenever Elena mentioned spending an evening in the library, and even Nathaniel, usually reserved in his observations, had commented once that he had not seen the king this at ease in years. Not everyone shared their quiet happiness. Simon's suspicion had only sharpened with time, and Elena often felt his sharp eyes tracking her movements through the castle, calculating and cold. She tried not to let his hostility trouble her, focusing instead on the growing warmth between herself and Roderick, the small comforts of a life she had never expected to find in a kingdom given to her as payment for an old debt. It was on an unusually quiet evening, during a formal dinner held to welcome a visiting delegation from a neighboring territory, that everything changed. The great hall had been prepared with more care than usual, long tables set with the castle's finest, though still modest, dinnerware, candles flickering warmly against the cold outside. Elena sat near Roderick's side, as had become custom in recent weeks, watching as he greeted the visiting delegation with the careful diplomacy she had come to recognize as one of his many quiet strengths. The delegation's leader, a tall, silver-haired man named Cedric, seemed pleasant enough at first, exchanging polite conversation with Roderick about trade agreements and shared borders. But something about the visitor unsettled Elena from the moment he arrived, a wrongness she could not quite place, subtle enough that she dismissed it as simple unfamiliarity rather than any real cause for concern. She would later realize how costly that dismissal nearly became. Midway through the meal, as servants moved quietly between the tables refilling cups and clearing empty plates, Elena noticed one of the delegation's attendants moving with unusual purpose toward the head table, a hand slipping subtly beneath his cloak. Something in his posture, tense and deliberate, sent a sharp jolt of alarm through her chest. "Roderick," she said quietly, urgently, but it was already too late. The attendant lunged forward, a blade flashing beneath the candlelight, aimed directly at Roderick's exposed side. Chaos erupted instantly, shouts filling the hall as guards scrambled to respond, but they were too far, too slow, and Elena understood, with sudden terrifying clarity, that no one would reach Roderick in time. She did not think. She simply moved, throwing herself between Roderick and the attacker without a single moment's hesitation. The blade never touched her. Instead, the moment the attacker's weapon came within inches of Elena's skin, something inside her chest exploded outward, a burst of golden light so bright it filled the entire hall, forcing every person present to shield their eyes. The attendant was thrown backward as though struck by an invisible force, his blade clattering uselessly to the stone floor. For a long, stunned moment, the great hall fell utterly silent. Elena stood frozen, her own hands trembling as she stared down at herself, golden light still flickering faintly along her skin, like dying embers, fading slowly back into nothing. Every eye in the hall was fixed on her, shock and fear mingling openly on faces that moments before had been calm and composed. "What?" Simon finally breathed, his voice barely audible in the stunned silence. "Was that?" Elena did not have an answer. She turned to look at Roderick, and found him staring at her with an expression she had never seen from him before. Not fear exactly, but something close to it, layered over unmistakable relief and dawning wonder. "Elena," he said softly, "are you hurt?" "I do not think so," she managed, her voice shaking. "I do not understand what just happened." Guards had already seized the attacker, dragging him roughly toward the dungeons for questioning, while the visiting delegation looked on with expressions ranging from shock to poorly hidden calculation. Cedric, the delegation's leader, stepped forward, his earlier pleasant demeanor entirely vanished. "Forgive the disturbance, Your Majesty," he said smoothly, though something in his tone rang hollow. "That man was not meant to be part of our delegation. We will investigate immediately." Roderick's eyes narrowed sharply. "See that you do," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge Elena had never heard from him before. "And know that this incident will not be forgotten easily." As the visiting delegation departed in hurried, uncomfortable silence, the great hall slowly emptied of its remaining guests, leaving only Roderick, Elena, and a small handful of trusted advisors, including Margaret and Nathaniel. The moment they were finally alone, Roderick turned to Elena, closing the distance between them in quick, urgent strides. "What happened?" he asked, his usual composure entirely abandoned, replaced by open concern. "That light, it came from you." "I do not know," Elena admitted, her voice trembling now that the immediate danger had passed, and the full weight of what had occurred began settling over her. "I only knew he was going to hurt you, and then I felt this warmth, this power, and it simply happened." Margaret, who had watched the entire exchange with careful, thoughtful eyes, finally spoke. "Your Majesty," she said slowly, "I believe I may know what we just witnessed, but it is something spoken of only in very old texts, and I would need to consult the castle archives to be certain." "Then consult them," Roderick said immediately. "Tonight, if necessary." Margaret nodded and hurried from the hall, leaving Roderick and Elena alone, amid the wreckage of the interrupted dinner, scattered plates and overturned chairs, bearing silent witness to how quickly everything had changed. "You saved my life," Roderick said quietly, once they were finally alone. "I could not simply stand by," Elena said. "Not when I could stop it." Roderick reached out, gently taking her still trembling hands in his own. "Whatever that power is," he said softly, "whatever it means, I am grateful beyond words that you were here tonight." Elena looked up at him, still shaken, but steadied somewhat by the warmth of his hands around hers. "I am frightened," she admitted honestly. "I do not know what is happening to me." "Then we will discover it together," Roderick said, his voice firm with quiet determination. "Whatever this power is, Elena, I do not believe it makes you dangerous. I believe it makes you exactly what this kingdom has needed for a very long time, though I confess, I do not yet fully understand why." Later that night, unable to sleep after everything that had transpired, Elena sat alone in her chambers, staring at her own hands, searching for some remaining trace of the golden light that had erupted from her so suddenly during the attack. She felt different somehow, lighter and heavier all at once, as though a door long sealed shut within her had finally, irreversibly, begun to open. She thought of her mother, of the stories she used to tell when Elena was young, half-remembered tales of old bloodlines and forgotten powers that once shaped the fate of entire kingdoms. She had always assumed they were simply stories, comforting fictions meant to entertain a restless child. Now, she was no longer certain. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Margaret standing outside, an old, leather-bound book clutched tightly in her hands, her expression a careful mixture of caution and barely contained excitement. "I found something," Margaret said quietly. "I think you should see this immediately, before we bring it to the king." Elena stepped aside, allowing Margaret into her chambers, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and undeniable anticipation. Whatever waited within the pages of that ancient book, she understood, with quiet certainty, that her life was about to change once again, more dramatically and more irreversibly than even Damien's cruel rejection had managed months before. The power within her, long dormant and now finally awakened, was only just beginning to make itself known. Margaret set the old book carefully on the small table near Elena's window, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. The parchment was brittle with age, the ink faded to a soft brown, but the illustration on the page was unmistakable. A woman surrounded by golden light, her hands raised toward a burning sky. "This text was written nearly 300 years ago," Margaret explained, her voice hushed with a reverence Elena had not heard from her before. "It speaks of a bloodline called the Emberborn, individuals said to carry an ancient power tied to protection and renewal. According to the old stories, the Emberborn were once considered the deciding force in conflicts between kingdoms, capable of turning the tide of entire wars with their abilities." "That cannot be me," Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she felt the warmth in her chest stir gently, as though responding to the very idea. "My family were simple pack members. There was nothing extraordinary about my upbringing. Perhaps not that you were aware of," Margaret said carefully. "But bloodlines can remain dormant for generations, waiting for the right circumstances to awaken. The old texts suggest the power often reveals itself during moments of great emotional intensity, particularly moments involving the protection of someone deeply cared for." Elena thought immediately of the attack in the Great Hall, of the desperate, instinctive need to protect Roderick that had overwhelmed every other thought in that terrifying instant. She thought, too, of the warmth that had grown steadily within her chest since her arrival at Ashgrave Castle, the way it had pulsed brighter with every quiet moment shared beside the broken king. "If this is true," Elena said slowly, "what does it mean? What am I supposed to do with this power?" Margaret closed the book gently, her expression thoughtful. "I do not know all the answers," she admitted. "The texts are old, and much has likely been lost or exaggerated over the centuries, but I believe we must inform the king immediately. This is not something that can remain hidden, not after tonight." They found Roderick still awake in his chambers, staring into the low fire much as he had been the first night Elena arrived at the castle. He looked up immediately as they entered, his expression tightening with concern at the sight of the old book in Margaret's hands. "Tell me what you found," he said. Margaret explained everything carefully, laying out the old legend of the Emberborn bloodline, while Roderick listened in tense, focused silence. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting to Elena with an expression she could not quite read. "Do you believe this is true?" he asked her directly. "I do not know what to believe," Elena admitted, "but I cannot deny what happened tonight. That power came from somewhere, and it responded to my need to protect you." Roderick rose from his seat, crossing the room to stand before her, his eyes searching hers with quiet intensity. "If this is true," he said slowly, "it changes everything. Emberborn power, if it truly exists as the old texts describe, would be sought after by every kingdom and every pack within 1,000 miles. There are those who would see it as a weapon to be claimed, rather than a person to be respected." The weight of his words settled heavily over Elena, and for the first time since the golden light had erupted from her chest, true fear began to take hold, not of the power itself, but of what others might do to possess it. "The Blackthorn pack," she said quietly, realization dawning slowly and unpleasantly. "If they learn of this, they will want me back." "Yes," Roderick said grimly, "and they will not be the only ones. Word of tonight's incident will spread quickly, especially once the visiting delegation returns home. Whoever sent that attacker will know exactly what kind of power now resides in my court." You believe the attack was connected to this? Elena asked, a new layer of dread settling over her. I believe it is too great a coincidence to ignore, Roderick said. Perhaps someone already suspected what you might be capable of, and sought to eliminate the threat before it could fully awaken. If that is true, then tonight's failure will only encourage them to try again, more carefully next time. Elena felt the room tilt slightly beneath her, the full weight of her new reality crashing over her all at once. She had come to Ashgrave Castle already broken by rejection, already stripped of the life she once believed was hers. Now, it seemed, an even greater upheaval waited ahead, one that threatened not only her own safety, but the fragile peace Roderick had worked so hard to maintain within his struggling kingdom. What do we do? She asked quietly. Roderick reached out, gently taking her hands in his expression steady, despite the uncertainty of everything they now faced together. We prepare, he said firmly. We train you to understand and control this power, so that whoever comes seeking to claim or destroy it finds you ready rather than vulnerable. And we strengthen the defenses of this castle, in case tonight's attack was only the beginning of something larger. You would help me with this? Elena asked, though she already suspected his answer. Elena, Roderick said softly, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. You saved my life tonight, without a moment's hesitation, at great personal risk to yourself. I will not abandon you now, not when you need support more than ever. Whatever comes next, we will face it together. The certainty in his voice steadied something fragile within her, and despite the fear still coiling tightly in her chest, Elena felt a small, stubborn flicker of hope beginning to grow alongside it. She was not facing this unknown power alone, not the way she had faced Damien's rejection, isolated and unsupported. This time, she had allies, people who believed in her, rather than discarding her the moment she proved inconvenient or unexpected. Over the following days, Margaret continued researching the old texts, uncovering fragments of information about the Emberborn bloodline scattered across various historical records within the castle's extensive archives. Much of it remained frustratingly vague, contradictory accounts, written by scholars who themselves had likely never witnessed the power firsthand, but slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge. The Emberborn power, according to the oldest and most reliable texts, was deeply tied to emotion, particularly emotions related to protection, loyalty, and love. It could not be summoned through simple will alone, but rather emerged naturally during moments when the bearer's need to protect someone or something they cared deeply for became overwhelming. With practice and understanding, some texts suggested, the power could eventually be called upon more deliberately, though such control had reportedly taken years to develop, even among historical Emberborn individuals. Elena began spending her mornings with Margaret, poring over the ancient texts together, and her afternoons with Nathaniel, who had unexpectedly volunteered to help her practice controlling small, deliberate flickers of the golden warmth, now living permanently beneath her skin. Progress was slow, and often frustrating, the power refusing to answer to calm, controlled attempts, responding instead only to genuine emotional intensity that Elena found difficult to manufacture artificially. Perhaps, Nathaniel suggested one afternoon, after yet another failed attempt left Elena breathless and disappointed. The power is not meant to be controlled through force. Perhaps it simply needs to be trusted, allowed to emerge naturally when the moment calls for it, rather than commanded like a weapon. Elena considered his words carefully, thinking of the two moments the power had revealed itself so far. First in the quiet Blackthorn forest, as she released her grief over Damien's rejection, and then again in the great hall, as she threw herself between danger and the man she had come, almost without realizing it, to care for deeply. Both moments had been born from genuine, overwhelming emotion, rather than deliberate command. Perhaps you are right, she admitted quietly. As the days passed, Roderick grew increasingly protective, insisting on additional guards stationed near Elena's chambers, and accompanying her personally whenever she ventured beyond the castle's inner walls. Elena understood his caution, even appreciated it, though the growing restrictions occasionally left her feeling more like a treasure to be guarded than a person capable of protecting herself. I do not wish to feel like a prisoner within these walls, she told him one evening, as they walked together through the winter garden, snow now dusting the overgrown paths in a delicate layer of white. "That is not my intention," Roderick said, genuine regret coloring his voice. "I only fear losing you, Elena, now that I have only just begun to understand what having you here truly means to me." The honesty in his words caught her off guard, and she turned to face him fully, searching his expression in the soft winter moonlight. "What does it mean to you?" she asked softly. Roderick reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, his touch lingering with a tenderness that sent warmth blooming brightly through her entire chest. "It means," he said quietly, "that for the first time since I lost my brother and my mother, I have found someone who makes this broken kingdom feel less like a burden and more like something worth protecting alongside her, rather than for her alone." Elena felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, though this time they were not born from grief or humiliation, but from something far gentler and more overwhelming. "Roderick," she whispered. He leaned closer, and for a long, suspended moment, the entire world seemed to narrow down to the small distance still separating them. Then, gently, he closed that distance entirely, pressing a soft, careful kiss to her lips, one that Elena returned without a single moment's hesitation. When they finally parted, both of them slightly breathless in the cold winter air, Elena felt the warmth in her chest flare brighter than it ever had before, not in fear or danger this time, but in something that felt remarkably, wonderfully, like happiness. Neither of them yet knew how quickly that fragile happiness would be tested, nor how soon the forces already gathering beyond the castle walls, drawn by rumors of awakened Emberborn power, would arrive to challenge everything Elena and Roderick had begun building together. The news reached Ashgrave Castle on a cold morning, nearly 3 weeks after the attack, carried by a breathless messenger who had ridden through the night to deliver it. Margaret brought word to Elena directly, her expression grave as she relayed the message. "The Blackthorn Pack has sent a delegation," Margaret said. "They are already at the castle gates, requesting an audience with the king. Elena, Damien is among them." Elena felt her stomach drop. Old wounds she had thought were healing, reopening with sudden, sharp intensity. She had not seen Damien since the night of her rejection, had not expected to see him again at all, and certainly not here, in the one place she had begun to feel something close to safe. "Why would he come here?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer, cold dread settling heavily in her chest. "I imagine," Margaret said carefully, "that word of what happened during the attack has reached the Blackthorn territory. If they know what you truly are now, Elena, I fear they no longer consider their debt fully settled." Elena found Roderick already in the great hall when she arrived, his expression tight with barely controlled tension as he prepared to receive the unwelcome delegation. He turned as she entered, his gaze softening slightly despite the gravity of the situation. "You do not have to be present for this," he said gently. "I can meet with them alone." "No," Elena said firmly, steadying herself despite the fear still coiling tightly in her stomach. "This concerns me directly. I will not hide from it." Roderick studied her for a long moment, before nodding, respect evident in his expression. "Stay close to me then," he said quietly. "Whatever they want, we will face it together." The doors to the great hall opened moments later, and Damien entered flanked by several senior pack members, including the elder Edwin, who had first explained Elena's fate to her, all those months before. Damien looked much the same as Elena remembered, though something in his posture seemed less certain than the cold, decisive figure who had rejected her so publicly in the Blackthorn ceremony hall. "Your Majesty," Damien said, offering Roderick a stiff, formal bow. "Thank you for granting us this audience." "State your purpose quickly," Roderick said, his voice carrying none of its usual patience. "I have little tolerance for wasted time this morning." Damien's eyes shifted briefly to Elena, something unreadable flickering across his expression, before he composed himself and returned his attention to Roderick. "We have received troubling reports," he said carefully, "regarding an incident that occurred within your court several weeks ago. Reports of a considerable and unusual power." "And what business is that of the Blackthorn Pack?" Roderick asked coldly. Edwin stepped forward, his expression carefully diplomatic. "Your Majesty, if the reports are accurate, then Elena Voss carries a bloodline of significant historical importance, one that originated, at least in recent generations, within our pack's territory. We believe there may have been an oversight in her original transfer to your court, an oversight that requires correction. You wish to reclaim her, Roderick said flatly, now that you understand her true value. We wish to discuss the matter appropriately, Edwin said, though his careful phrasing did little to disguise the true intent behind his words. Elena felt anger flare hot and sharp within her chest, the warmth of her power stirring in response to the injustice of it all. You rejected me, she said, stepping forward before either Roderick or the pack delegation could continue their careful political dance. You cast me aside publicly, humiliated me in front of everyone I had ever known, and handed me over as payment for a debt, without a single thought for what I wanted. Now, because it turns out I am valuable after all, you believe you have the right to simply reclaim me? Damien's jaw tightened, something like genuine discomfort crossing his features for the first time since entering the hall. Elena, he said quietly, I did not fully understand what I was giving up when I rejected the bond between us. If you had known, Elena interrupted, her voice steady despite the anger burning within her. You would have kept me only for what I could offer you, not for who I actually am. That is not something I am willing to return to, regardless of what power I now carry. A tense silence fell over the great hall, broken finally by Edwin's careful, measured voice. Your Majesty, he said, turning back to Roderick, surely you understand the delicate position this creates. A bond, even one rejected, carries certain claims under pack law. If Elena's power is indeed as significant as we suspect, other kingdoms and packs will soon seek to claim her for themselves. It would be safer, and more appropriate, for her to return to her own bloodline's territory, where she can be properly protected and guided. Protected, Roderick repeated, his voice dangerously quiet, by the same pack that publicly humiliated her and then handed her away the moment it proved convenient. I think not. With respect, Your Majesty, Edwin pressed, this is not simply a matter of personal preference. The stability of the region depends on managing this situation carefully. Powerful bloodlines have started wars in the past when mishandled. Then let us handle it carefully, Roderick said, stepping forward to stand protectively beside Elena. Elena remains under my protection, by her own choice, not by obligation to any pack or kingdom. If the Blackthorn pack wishes to pursue this matter further, they will find themselves negotiating with a king who has no intention of surrendering someone under his protection, simply because her value has recently become apparent to those who once discarded her. Damien stepped forward suddenly, something desperate entering his expression. Elena, he said, the bond between us can still be restored, if you wish it. I was wrong to reject you so publicly, wrong to let politics dictate something that should have remained between us alone. If you return, I promise things will be different. Elena looked at him for a long moment, searching for any trace of the desperate hope she might once have felt at such words. She found none. Instead, she felt only a quiet, settled certainty, the kind that came from having finally discovered what genuine care and respect actually felt like, in contrast to what she had once mistakenly accepted as love. No, she said simply, I will not return to a bond built on convenience, and reclaimed only once I became useful. Whatever I am now, Damien, I did not become it for your benefit, and I will not allow myself to be claimed by you again. The finality in her voice left little room for further argument, though Edwin's expression darkened with poorly concealed frustration. This matter will not simply end here, he warned. There are those beyond our pack who will not accept refusal so easily, Your Majesty. I would advise you to consider the full weight of what you are choosing to protect. I have already considered it fully, Roderick said, his voice steady and unwavering, and I remain entirely resolved. You may deliver that message to whoever sent you here with such expectations. The Blackthorn delegation departed shortly after, their earlier confidence replaced by tense, uncertain frustration. Damien lingered a moment longer than the others, his gaze finding Elena's one final time before he turned to follow his pack elders from the hall, something like genuine regret visible in his expression as he left. Once the great hall had emptied, Elena finally allowed herself to release the tension she had been holding throughout the entire confrontation, her shoulders sagging slightly as adrenaline began to fade. "Are you all right?" Roderick asked, gently placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "I think so," Elena said, though her voice still carried traces of the anger and fear the confrontation had stirred within her. "I did not expect to feel so little, seeing him again. I thought it would hurt more." "Perhaps," Roderick said softly, "that is simply proof of how far you have already come since that rejection." Elena leaned into him slightly, grateful beyond words for his steady, unwavering presence beside her. "Edwin's warning troubles me," she admitted. "If others truly are seeking to claim this power, this may only be the beginning of far greater trouble." Roderick's expression grew serious, the weight of the kingdom's uncertain future settling visibly over his features once more. "Then we will prepare for whatever comes next," he said firmly. "Together, as we agreed." Neither of them yet fully understood how quickly Edwin's warning would prove true, nor how soon the fragile peace surrounding Ashgrave Castle would be shattered entirely by forces far more dangerous than a single rejected alpha seeking to reclaim what he had so carelessly cast aside. In the weeks following Damien's departure, an uneasy quiet settled over Ashgrave Castle, the kind of silence that felt less like peace and more like the pause before a storm. Roderick doubled the castle's guard, sent scouts to monitor the surrounding borders, and spent long hours each evening reviewing reports with his senior advisors, searching for any sign of the trouble Edwin had promised would follow their refusal. Elena continued her training with Nathaniel, growing steadily more comfortable with the warmth beneath her skin, though true control remained frustratingly elusive. She had learned to summon small, controlled flickers of golden light during moments of calm concentration, but the true depth of her power still seemed tied irrevocably to genuine emotional intensity, refusing to answer fully to anything less. "You are improving," Nathaniel told her one afternoon, as she managed to hold a steady glow along her palm for nearly a full minute before it faded. "Whatever comes next, you will not face it as unprepared as you might have been only weeks ago." Elena appreciated his encouragement, though a persistent unease continued to gnaw at her, a quiet certainty that whatever storm was gathering beyond the castle walls would arrive sooner than any of them were truly ready for. She was not wrong. The warning came just after sunset, nearly a month after the Blackthorn delegation's departure, when one of the castle's border scouts arrived at the gates in a state of near collapse, his horse lathered with exhaustion, his voice hoarse from shouting warnings the entire ride back. "Riders," he gasped, as guards helped him from his saddle. "A great many riders, approaching from the eastern road, Blackthorn colors among them, but others as well, banners I did not recognize. They will reach the castle by morning." Roderick received the news in the great hall, his expression hardening into the focused, determined calm Elena had come to recognize whenever true danger threatened. "How many?" he asked sharply. "Difficult to say for certain in the darkness," the scout admitted, "but enough to concern me greatly, Your Majesty. Perhaps several hundred, possibly more." A tense murmur spread through the gathered advisors, fear and calculation mingling openly on their faces. Simon, predictably, was the first to speak his concerns aloud. "This is precisely what I feared," he said, his voice tight with barely restrained panic. "The Blackthorn pack has allied with others who seek to claim Elena's power for themselves. We are not prepared to withstand a force of that size." "We will be prepared," Roderick said firmly, cutting off further panic before it could spread. "Sound the alarms. Recall every available guard to the castle walls. Send word to the nearby villages to seek shelter within our walls if they wish it, and prepare what defenses we have." The castle exploded into organized chaos as Roderick's orders were carried out, guards rushing to their posts, servants hurrying to prepare emergency supplies, the entire kingdom bracing itself for a conflict none of them had truly expected to face so soon. Elena found herself swept along in the preparations, her earlier uncertainty giving way to a fierce, protective determination as she watched the people of Ashgrave Castle, people who had shown her more genuine kindness in a few short months than the Blackthorn pack had offered in her entire lifetime, preparing to defend their home against an approaching threat drawn there, at least in part, because of her. "This is my fault," she said quietly, finding Roderick alone for a brief moment amid the chaos, reviewing defensive positions spread across a map in his private study. "No," Roderick said firmly, looking up from the map to meet her eyes directly. This is the fault of those who seek to claim power that does not belong to them, and who value conquest over the well-being of the people caught between their ambitions. You are not responsible for their greed, Elena. But if I were not here, none of this would be happening. Roderick crossed the room quickly, taking her face gently between his hands, his expression fierce with quiet conviction. If you were not here, he said, I would already have lost far more than a kingdom's peace, Elena. I would have lost my life during that attack in the Great Hall, and countless other moments of happiness I never expected to find again after losing my brother and my mother. Whatever comes tomorrow, I do not regret a single moment of choosing to protect you, and I never will. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, though she blinked them back quickly, steadying herself with the same fierce determination she saw reflected in Roderick's gaze. Then let us protect this kingdom together, she said firmly, and prove to whoever approaches that we are not so easily conquered. Roderick leaned forward, pressing a brief, urgent kiss to her lips, one filled with all the unspoken fear and determination neither of them had time to fully voice aloud. Together, he agreed quietly. The night passed in tense, exhausting preparation, guards taking their positions along the castle walls, villagers from the surrounding countryside arriving throughout the night, seeking shelter within the fortress, their frightened faces a stark reminder of exactly what was at stake, should the coming battle be lost. Dawn arrived gray and cold, the approaching army finally visible on the horizon as the first light broke over the eastern hills. Elena stood beside Roderick atop the castle's outer wall, watching the massive force draw steadily closer, banners she now recognized as belonging not only to the Blackthorn pack, but to several other territories as well, all apparently united by a shared desire to claim the power now living within her. There are more than I feared, Roderick said quietly, his expression grim as he assessed the approaching threat. We are significantly outnumbered. Then we will need every advantage we can find, Elena said, her voice steadier than she felt, the warmth in her chest already beginning to stir in response to the danger gathering before them. As the approaching army drew close enough for individual figures to become visible, Elena spotted Damien near the front of the Blackthorn forces, his expression unreadable even from this distance. Beside him rode a figure she did not recognize, clad in dark armor bearing an unfamiliar crest, clearly a leader among the allied territories that had joined this assault. That is Lord Varric, Nathaniel said grimly, joining them atop the wall, ruler of the Eastern Territories, and a man known for his ruthless ambition. If he has joined this cause, it confirms our worst fears. This is no longer simply about settling an old grievance. This is a coordinated attempt to seize Emberborn power for far more dangerous purposes. Roderick's expression hardened further, his hand instinctively finding the hilt of his sword. Then we give them no opportunity to succeed, he said firmly. As the approaching forces drew within range, a single rider broke away from the main army, approaching the castle gates under a banner of parley. Roderick and Elena descended quickly to meet the messenger, guards flanking them protectively, as the rider delivered Lord Varric's demands. Lord Varric offers a single choice, the messenger announced, his voice carrying clearly across the tense courtyard. Surrender the one known as the Emberborn peacefully, and this army will withdraw without further conflict. Refuse, and this castle, along with everyone within it, will face the full consequences of that decision. Elena felt the weight of hundreds of lives now resting heavily on her shoulders, the frightened faces of the villagers who had sought shelter within the castle walls flashing through her mind. For one brief, terrifying moment, she considered surrendering herself, sacrificing her own safety to spare the kingdom the devastation of a battle they seemed unlikely to win. Roderick, as though sensing her thoughts, reached out and took her hand firmly in his own, his grip steady and unwavering. We do not surrender what does not belong to Lord Varric to claim, he said, his voice carrying clearly enough for the messenger, and likely much of the watching army beyond to hear. Return to your master, and inform him that Ashgrave Castle will defend what is rightfully under its protection, regardless of the cost. The messenger's expression flickered with something like grudging respect, before he turned his horse and rode swiftly back toward the waiting army, delivering Roderick's defiant refusal. As the massive force began organizing for their assault, Elena turned to Roderick, the warmth in her chest burning fiercely now, no longer a quiet flicker, but a steady, growing fire that seemed to sense, with absolute clarity, exactly what was coming. "Whatever happens today," she said quietly, "thank you for never once treating me as something to be traded or claimed." Roderick squeezed her hand gently, his expression fierce with unwavering determination. "Thank you," he said, "for reminding me what this kingdom, and this life, are truly worth fighting for." Together, they turned to face the approaching army, the golden warmth within Elena's chest, building steadily towards something neither Ashgrave Castle, nor the forces gathered against it, were fully prepared to witness. The first wave of the assault struck the castle's outer defenses just after midday, the combined forces of the Blackthorn Pack and Lord Varric's allied territories, surging forward with grim determination. Ashgrave's defenders held their positions along the walls, arrows and defensive spells meeting the advancing lines, but Elena could see clearly, even from her position within the castle courtyard, that the sheer size of the opposing force threatened to overwhelm their defenses within hours rather than days. She had insisted on staying near the front lines, rather than sheltering safely within the castle's inner chambers, and after considerable argument, Roderick had reluctantly agreed, understanding that whatever power lived within her might prove essential to the kingdom's survival before the day was through. "They are pressing hardest against the eastern wall," Nathaniel reported, arriving breathless beside them, as the battle's chaos continued to unfold around the courtyard. "Our defenders there are struggling to hold the line." Roderick's jaw tightened. "I will lead reinforcements there myself," he said. "Elena, stay here, within the courtyard's protection, until—" "No," Elena interrupted firmly. "I am not staying behind while you face danger without me. Whatever this power is, it responds most strongly when those I care for are threatened. I would rather stand beside you than wait helplessly here, wondering if you are safe." Roderick studied her for a brief, tense moment, before nodding, understanding evident in his expression, despite his obvious reluctance to place her in further danger. "Then stay close," he said firmly. "Whatever happens." They made their way quickly toward the eastern wall, the sounds of battle growing louder and more chaotic with every step, shouts and clashing weapons mixing with the acrid smell of smoke from fires already beginning to spread along the castle's outer structures. Elena felt fear coiling tightly in her stomach, but beneath it, steady and growing, the warmth of her power continued building, responding instinctively to the danger surrounding them. They arrived at the eastern wall to find the defenders badly outnumbered, Lord Varric's forces having breached a section of the outer barricade, allowing enemy soldiers to pour steadily into the castle grounds. Roderick immediately joined the fighting, his sword flashing skillfully as he worked to push back the advancing soldiers, Nathaniel and several guards fighting fiercely alongside him. Elena watched, heart pounding, as the battle raged fiercely around her, searching desperately for some way to help, without simply adding herself as another target for the enemy soldiers to focus upon. Then she saw him, Lord Varric himself, directing his forces from horseback near the breached barricade, his expression cold and calculating as he watched the battle unfold with the detached interest of a man who viewed the entire conflict as nothing more than a transaction to be completed. Their eyes met briefly across the chaos, and something in Varric's expression shifted, recognition and calculation sharpening into focused intent. He turned his horse deliberately toward her, several soldiers breaking away from the main assault to follow his lead, clearly under orders to capture, rather than harm the valuable prize they had traveled so far to claim. "Elena," Roderick's voice cut through the chaos, alarm evident as he noticed the soldiers advancing toward her. He fought fiercely to reach her side, but the press of battle between them made swift progress impossible. Elena backed away as the soldiers advanced, her mind racing for some way to defend herself, but retreat only brought her closer to the wall, cutting off any possibility of escape. Fear surged sharply through her chest, sharp and immediate, and beneath it, the warmth of her power flared brilliantly in response. The first soldier reached for her, and instinct took over entirely. Golden light erupted outward from her chest, far more powerful than anything she had summoned before, throwing the advancing soldiers backward with tremendous force. The light did not fade quickly this time, instead continuing to build, wrapping around her like a living shield, growing brighter with every passing second, as her fear transformed into fierce, protective determination. Lord Varric reined his horse back sharply, his earlier calculating calm replaced by open shock as he watched the golden light continue expanding, illuminating the entire courtyard with brilliant, undeniable power. "Impossible," he breathed, though his voice carried clearly enough across the suddenly quieting battlefield that both allies and enemies alike turned to witness the spectacle unfolding before them. Elena felt the power surging through her, no longer a quiet warmth but a roaring, overwhelming force that seemed to respond directly to every protective instinct within her, every fierce determination to defend the people and the kingdom she had come, against all expectation, to genuinely love. She thought of Roderick, of Margaret and Nathaniel, of the frightened villagers sheltering within the castle walls, of everyone who had shown her genuine kindness rather than convenient use. The golden light expanded outward in a brilliant wave, not harming those who meant no threat, but pushing back forcefully against every soldier who had come seeking to claim her as a weapon or a prize. Soldiers stumbled backward, their weapons falling uselessly from suddenly weakened grips, disoriented by the sheer, overwhelming presence of power they had never truly understood or respected. Roderick finally broke through the chaos to reach her side, his expression a mixture of awe and fierce protective pride, as he watched the power fully manifest for the first time. "Elena," he said softly, though his voice carried clearly even amid the settling chaos, "you are magnificent." Lord Varric, recovering quickly from his initial shock, raised his voice sharply, rallying his stunned soldiers back into formation. "She is only one person," he shouted. "Overwhelm her with numbers, and this power means nothing against a full assault." The soldiers hesitated only briefly before renewing their advance, and Elena felt a fresh wave of fear rise within her, uncertain whether her still developing control over this newfound power could truly withstand a coordinated assault from so many opponents at once. It was then that Damien finally made his choice. He had been fighting near the edge of the courtyard throughout the battle, caught between loyalty to the alliance his pack had formed, and something else, something Elena had glimpsed briefly during their earlier confrontation in the Great Hall. Now, watching Elena's power fully revealed, watching the genuine devotion in Roderic's expression as he moved instinctively to shield her from the renewed assault, something in Damien's expression shifted entirely. "Enough," Damien roared, turning his sword suddenly against the very soldiers he had arrived alongside. "This was never meant to be a war for conquest. We came to settle an old grievance, not to steal power that clearly belongs to someone who has earned genuine loyalty and protection here." His unexpected defiance created chaos among the Blackthorn ranks, soldiers hesitating, uncertain whether to follow their alpha's sudden reversal or continue following Lord Varric's ruthless ambition. The confusion spread quickly, weakening the coordinated assault at exactly the moment Elena needed every possible advantage. Drawing on the fierce determination surging through her, Elena closed her eyes briefly, focusing entirely on the people she needed to protect, on the kingdom that had shown her genuine belonging for the first time in her entire life. The golden light within her surged forward one final time, expanding outward in a powerful, decisive wave that swept across the courtyard, disarming the remaining soldiers, still loyal to Lord Varric's ambition, without causing serious harm to any of them. Lord Varric's horse reared sharply beneath him as the wave of power washed over the battlefield, and in the chaos, several of Ashgrave's remaining defenders seized the opportunity to surround and capture him before he could rally his scattered forces for a renewed assault. Slowly, gradually, the battle wound down around them, the combined army's coordinated assault having collapsed entirely in the face of Elena's fully awakened power and Damien's unexpected defiance. Soldiers who had come seeking conquest found themselves instead surrendering, disarmed and disoriented, while Ashgrave's defenders moved quickly to secure the courtyard and tend to the wounded scattered across the battlefield. Elena finally allowed the golden light to fade, exhaustion crashing over her all at once as the adrenaline of battle began to recede. Roderick caught her gently as her knees weakened, holding her steady against his chest as the courtyard around them slowly settled into the quiet, exhausted aftermath of conflict survived. "You did it," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved this kingdom, Elena." "We saved it," she corrected weakly, allowing herself, finally, to lean fully into his support. Together. Nearby, Damien approached slowly, his expression a complicated mixture of exhaustion and quiet regret. "I am sorry," he said simply, addressing Elena directly for the first time since arriving at Ashgrave Castle with Lord Varric's forces. "For everything. I should have seen your worth long before circumstances forced me to." Elena studied him for a long moment, too exhausted for lingering anger, though the old wound of his rejection had not entirely healed. "Thank you," she said finally, "for choosing to do what was right today, even if it came later than it should have." As the sun began to set over the battle-scarred courtyard, casting long shadows across the aftermath of the conflict, Elena allowed herself, finally, to fully rest against Roderick's steady support, the golden warmth within her chest settling into a quiet, contented glow, no longer simply a power to be feared, but a strength fully claimed and fully hers. In the days following the battle, Ashgrave Castle slowly began the long process of recovery. The wounded were tended carefully by healers, working tirelessly through both day and night. Damaged sections of the outer walls were assessed for repair, and the captured soldiers, including Lord Varric himself, were held securely, while Roderick and his advisors determined the appropriate consequences for their failed assault. Lord Varric, stripped of his earlier confidence, offered little resistance when finally brought before Roderick's court for judgment. "You cannot hold me indefinitely," he warned, though his voice carried none of the commanding certainty it once had. "My territory will not simply accept my continued captivity without response." "Your territory will accept whatever terms allow for your release," Roderick said coldly. "Terms that will include significant reparations for the damage caused here, and a formal, binding agreement that no further attempts will be made to claim Elena or her abilities by force. Refuse these terms, and you may remain our guest indefinitely." Faced with little alternative, Lord Varric reluctantly agreed to the terms, and within days, formal negotiations began between Ashgrave and the Eastern Territories, negotiations that Elena, now recognized fully as an essential figure within Roderick's court, participated in directly. The Blackthorn Pack's situation proved somewhat more complicated. Damien's unexpected defiance during the battle had fractured the pack's unity considerably, older elders like Edwin facing significant criticism for their role in orchestrating the alliance with Lord Varric's ambitious forces. In the aftermath, Damien found himself navigating a delicate transition of leadership within his own pack, one that ultimately saw several of the elders who had pushed hardest for the alliance stripped of their influence entirely. "I do not know what remains of my authority within the pack," Damien admitted, during a brief, quiet conversation with Elena shortly before the Blackthorn delegation finally departed from Ashgrave Castle. "Many blame me for the alliance's failure, despite my final decision to abandon it." "Perhaps," Elena said, without malice, "this is an opportunity to rebuild your pack into something better than it was, something that values its members, rather than treating them as tools to be discarded or reclaimed as convenient." Damien studied her for a long moment, something like genuine respect finally settling into his expression. "You have grown remarkably wise, Elena," he said quietly. "I hope, in time, my pack might learn to reflect even a fraction of the strength and grace you have shown throughout everything that has happened." As winter finally began giving way to the first tentative signs of spring, life at Ashgrave Castle settled into a new, hopeful rhythm. The overgrown gardens that Elena had first wandered through months earlier began showing early signs of renewal, small green shoots pushing determinedly through the last patches of melting snow, and Elena found herself, more often than not, tending carefully to the very same overgrown paths where she and Roderick had first begun building the fragile trust that had grown, over months of shared vulnerability and quiet understanding, into something neither of them had expected, but both had come to treasure deeply. Roderick found her there one bright spring morning, kneeling carefully among newly planted flowers, sunlight catching gently in her hair as she worked. He watched her for a long moment before approaching, something soft and unguarded in his expression that Elena had rarely seen from him during those first difficult weeks after her arrival. "The gardens are beginning to look like they once did," he said quietly, settling beside her among the flower beds. "My mother would have been pleased." "I hope so," Elena said, smiling warmly as she brushed dirt gently from her hands. It felt important somehow to help this place heal alongside everything else that has changed. Roderick reached out, taking her hand gently in his own, his expression turning suddenly serious despite the warmth still lingering in his eyes. "Elena," he said, "these past months have changed everything I once believed about myself, about this kingdom, and about what genuine partnership could mean. I do not wish to simply continue as we have been, grateful for whatever time circumstances allow us. I wish to build something permanent, something chosen freely, rather than simply survive together." Elena felt her heart quicken, understanding slowly dawning as Roderick reached into his coat, withdrawing a simple, elegant ring crafted from gold that seemed to catch the morning light exactly the same way her own power once had during its earliest, quiet awakening. "Elena Voss," Roderick said softly, "you arrived at this castle as payment for an old debt, cast aside by those who failed to recognize your true worth. I do not offer you a crown out of obligation, or gratitude, or even simply love, though I do love you, more deeply than I ever believed myself capable of feeling again. I offer it because you have shown this kingdom, and shown me personally, exactly what genuine strength, genuine kindness, and genuine partnership can accomplish. Will you rule beside me, not as someone claimed or given away, but as someone who chooses this life and this kingdom entirely for herself?" Tears gathered in Elena's eyes, though this time, as had become true so often since her arrival at Ashgrave Castle, they were tears born entirely from happiness rather than grief. "Yes," she said softly, her voice steady with quiet certainty. "I choose this. I choose you, and this kingdom, and everything we might build together, freely and completely." Roderick slipped the ring gently onto her finger, and as their lips met in a soft, joyful kiss, Elena felt the warmth within her chest flare brightly once more, no longer a power born from fear or danger, but something entirely different, a golden light, born purely from happiness, belonging, and love freely given and freely received. Their coronation, when it finally arrived several weeks later, drew visitors from across the region, including, surprisingly, a small delegation from the restructured Blackthorn Pack, now led by a humbled and considerably wiser Damien, and representatives from the Eastern Territories, eager to formally establish peaceful relations following Lord Varric's failed ambitions. Margaret oversaw the elaborate preparations with fierce, protective pride, while Nathaniel stood proudly among the honored guards during the ceremony itself, having become one of Elena's most trusted friends throughout the many months of training and growth that had led to this moment. As Elena stood before the assembled crowd, golden light glowing softly and steadily around her during the formal coronation ceremony, she thought back to the night of her rejection, to the cold humiliation and overwhelming grief that had once threatened to define her entire future. She thought of the broken king she had first met beside a dying fire, guarded and distant, carrying grief so heavy it had nearly consumed him entirely. Neither of them remained broken any longer. "Rise," the castle's eldest priest declared, completing the final words of the coronation ceremony. "Queen Elena Ashgrave, protector of this kingdom, bearer of the awakened Emberborn power, and beloved partner to King Roderick Ashgrave." As Elena rose to her feet, the assembled crowd erupted into genuine joyful celebration, the golden light surrounding her glowing brighter and warmer than it ever had before, no longer feared as a dangerous unknown, but celebrated as the very strength that had ultimately protected and united an entire struggling kingdom. Roderick reached for her hand, his expression filled with a quiet, contented happiness that Elena knew, without any doubt, matched entirely her own. Together, they turned to face their kingdom, no longer a broken king and a rejected woman cast aside by those who failed to see her worth, but a queen and king united fully, by choice rather than circumstance, ready to build a future neither of them could have imagined during those first uncertain days, when fate had first, almost accidentally, brought them together. The gardens outside the castle walls continued blooming steadily throughout that spring, wild and beautiful, in exactly the way Elena had once described them to Roderick during their earliest, tentative conversations. And within the walls of Ashgrave Castle, a kingdom once weighed down by grief and hardship began, slowly and steadily, to heal fully at last, guided by a queen whose power had been awakened not through violence or ambition, but through genuine love, unwavering loyalty, and the quiet, powerful strength of finally being seen, valued, and chosen exactly as she truly was.